All right. Let me post this on Icon. Get you guys to know that it's going. Hello, Brian. Okay, I'm gonna remind everyone that the stream is today real quick and that it's up. And then I will start our lecture. If I could type, okay. I'll give it a couple minutes too, just to make sure we've got everyone up, because I know I was having trouble getting the stream started. Okay. Do you have any questions, Bryant, by the way, since it's just you and you right now? Can you see the slides okay? Does that look clear enough to you guys? I'm trying to make it as clear as possible. Oh, there you are. Hi, Hannah. I went from 1 to 4 like in an instant. Perfect. Okay, I have the classroom as dark as possible and the contrast as bright as possible, theoretically. Okay, questions after, works for me. The slides are already up on Icon as well, so if you guys want to follow along with me, you are welcome to. Or you can just take notes off of what I say. It's up to you. Sweet. I will take decent. That works for me. Fantastic. Awesome. Okay. I'm glad that it worked out easier. I don't get to do all my pretty, like colorful rainbow squares on it, but that's fine. I'll live with that. If it's clear to you guys. Definitely. Okay. No, the quiz will not be over this information. So that's why I was flexible on when we presented it this week. Quiz is just from, I believe, gray zone tactics to drones and robotics. So you don't need to have this information memorized for your quiz today. But make sure you have your quiz finished by the end of the day. I know that there's a possibility that Icon might have issues with it if you started, like really close to midnight and don't finish it before then. So make sure you have it done definitely before midnight, like completely finished, not just started. The information from last week, yes, will be in the quiz, just not the information from this week. Okay. Oh, can you? Definitely, yes. I try and restate the question a little bit, but if I'm not doing that clearly enough, it seems like I'm not, then I will fully just reread the question so that it's clear for when you watch it later. Okay, fantastic. We have about 7 people in here right now, so I think that's a pretty good number, kind of comparable to what we had last week. So I'll go ahead and start the lecture then. This week we're talking about privacy and how that kind of connects to national security. It's going to be a bit of an overlap of our discussion of cybersecurity, just because those concepts have been conflated so much, more recently, and how we talk about new technologies evolving. But I'm going to go in a bit more technical information on it, kind of how the process itself works and where the debates are actually coming from when we have these discussions about cybersecurity and privacy. So it's not as content heavy this week, but it is technical information. So if you guys have any questions about how this information, how these concepts work, then definitely ask me questions. I'll read the questions back as clearly as I can so we can try and make this go as smoothly as possible, because I know that this kind of technical information can be really difficult to understand. So the first thing, I just want to, again, go over what you need to have done this week. Make sure you have your quiz finished. There are some short answer style questions on that quiz, and Icon can't grade that by itself. It has to wait for me to go in and manually grade those and then have those points added back. So don't worry if you have, just a little lower score than you were expecting. Okay. So when we is 9/11, right? Especially the Patriot Act that was proposed right after 9/11. It created fundamental changes in how the country has really understood how we collect personal information and how we use personal information that has been collected, right? And this is more than just citizens from other countries. It's also domestic. It's called domestic surveillance, right? The surveillance of citizens within the United States or our own U.S. citizens. And in the article that you guys were assigned, you're kind of shown across a bunch of different categories how those standing of probable cause. You had to be able to state why you were trying to gather that information, or you had to have a preponderance of evidence for why you needed to violate an individual's privacy. Those restrictions were reduced after the Patriot Act as well. So not only did you see a massive expansion in where information could be gathered, but you saw a reduction in limits to what you actually needed to reach before you could gather that information. Any questions on that? Okay. So this is honestly one of my favorite quotes, not because I inherently believe that it's, a perfect quote, but I think it leads into a lot of really good discussion, and it really makes you kind of evaluate what you want to do or what you're placing value on when you're discussing different security measures, or what another person is placing value on when we're talking about security. So Ben Franklin has this very famous quote, which essentially, if I paraphrase it, if when you're choosing between security and freedom, you choose security, then you deserve neither, essentially, that you shouldn't be willing to give up how do you guys feel about that? Do you think in the world that we live in now that kind of a 100%, if you're willing to give up one over the other, then you deserve neither, that kind of mentality, do you think it's a reasonable standard to hold yourself up to? Or is it more of a cautionary note that just be careful of what you're doing? There's definitely even political parties that you could attribute to the all or nothing kind of mentality on this. Okay, so Hannah says she does not agree because people can't be trusted to keep ourselves safe without a little infringement on our liberty. I think that's fair. That's a lot of the legal arguments behind the Bill of Rights, right? Is that you have those unalienable rights, but you can have them until they infringe upon the safety of others. And then at that point, those rights can be restricted. So definitely, I think that's fair. Haley says there definitely needs to be a balance, but I think you can have both. Cody says it's a good theory, but hard to put into practice. Nate says it's unreasonable. It shouldn't be a zero-sum game. Hannah, it's kind of a spectrum, but you can go too far either way. Colleen says that it's more of a cautionary note. Technology today is a lot different than what it was back then. Definitely. And Bryant says in a perfect world, you could balance them. I think, yeah. So there seems to be a lot of consensus amongst you guys, but I think you're all kind of agreeing that more of a cautionary note, try and recognize maybe when you're going too far, but balance the two of them. I think that's fair. It's definitely, Ben Franklin had ideas and opinions on stuff, but you can definitely at least use this as a way to understand and try and evaluate, critically think about the new policies that are coming about, right? So the articles that I signed to you definitely were really critical about using these kinds of new laws or new tools to gain more technology or more information, but that doesn't mean that they've not accomplished anything over the course of their time, right? You could definitely say that even though you're infringing on, or people believe that feel that you're infringing on their rights, has this information helped us? So definitely kind of a jumping off point where you could start to critically evaluate future policies. All right. So if 9/11 created a lot of big changes, can we get a little bit more specific about what the actual changes are? So I tried to pick ones that I thought you guys would be more interested in, that pertain to maybe you more directly. I'm not sure if you guys have actually been in school. I know you definitely haven't been in higher education before the Patriot Act, but you might have been in like elementary school. But I can remember before and after on this, and there's a lot of like new changes that have developed over the years that really seem weird if you're coming at it from an outside perspective, but maybe if you grew up with it, it feels more natural. But anyway, be connected to terrorism. They can ask for access to your educational records. They can ask for credit scores and financial records changes. They can ask for your cable records, which I feel like isn't as relevant nowadays, but I guess if they have your internet records, then that is your cable. And they can actually ask a grand jury to not reveal information that's relevant to foreign security, or they can ask to be told it by the grand jury. So there's a lot more information, a lot more freedoms that they're granted based purely on the fact that they're arguing that the investigation that they're completing has something to do with terrorism. Which, do you guys think having a connection to terrorism is enough of a justification to give authorities these kinds of freedoms? Definitely not a question of if it would be helpful, because I think you could make an argument for any of these that they could be helpful in an investigation, but it's more, do you think that we should be willing to give up these kinds of rights, the rights to keep these private, based solely on the fact that the investigation has something to do with terrorism? All right, well, you guys think about that. I'm going to move to the next slide, but I want at least one opinion on this because I do think it's an interesting one. That's essentially your entire electronic persona, right? Oh, definitely. Brian wants me to repeat the question. Do you think if a cop comes up to you and says that this is part of a terrorist investigation, would you feel comfortable that they get access to all this information, right? Is it fair that solely based on the fact that it's connected to a terrorism investigation, all of this information about you can be turned over to the authorities? If 9/11 happened again, what would be the fallout? What would be the pushback from that? Better safe than sorry. Okay, yeah, I could see that for sure. I mean, there's that standard argument of, well, I have nothing to hide, so what does it matter, right, if they give this information? Bryant says kind of the same lines. I personally have no problem with it because I don't have anything I feel is worth hiding from the government. There we go. That is the standard argument against these kinds of things. And I don't expect them to post everything I do on social media. And then Paige adds, I think this information should only be given up if they can undoubtedly connect you to a crime. If they can prove you broke the law, then you should have to give up this info. And Cody adds, probably no, especially if they are just using terrorist investigation as casual, oh, you are using law words that I don't know, casus belli, to dig up everyone's personal information. All right, so a bit of a debate on that one. Some of you say, I have nothing to hide, it doesn't matter. And then others are being a bit more critical, maybe about how strong of a connection either you would have to that investigation or what the idea of terrorism has to whatever is going on. Okay, so they're given a lot of, the term would be discretion, really, on how to enforce this. So they're trusted to kind of apply the rules in the correct way. and make decisions on their own terms. So that means that there's a lot of wiggle room in what they can do, right? So you can actually see a lot of changes in how these investigations are applied, how much probable cause or how strong the connection is to a terrorist investigation, or how guilty they think that individual party is, which can either make some people like Paige or Cody maybe uncomfortable, or it doesn't matter to Brian and Haley because they have nothing to hide anyway. So good. Thank you guys for doing a discussion on the chat, because I think that's fantastic. Okay. So that's what the powers that they have now. It's probably what you guys have grown up with. Before that, before 9/11, this is kind of the standard that they had to work with. So in order for the government to gain access to, quote, private information, they only could look at necessary information. So they didn't get, blanket access to all of your cable records if they thought you did a crime. They could only get access to things connected to that crime. They had to state why they actually needed that information, right? You had to discuss with at least a judge, this is why I need this information. So justify their argument, and then actually keep that information that they gathered secure. So a little bit about, I think Brian had brought it up, they're not going to post it on social media, right? Under the new rules, there isn't as strict of a requirement that they don't have to keep that information that they've gathered as secure. So maybe it might end up on social media. There's nothing saying that they have to work on why they gather that information. So you need to tell someone, we think you're committing tax fraud. That's why we pulled up your taxes and all of your, receipts for your cable bill. So we think you're lying about it. And now they don't have to do that. They don't have to tell the individual why they gather that information on them. And then if they use a more public information source, that information source doesn't have to tell the public at large that they've given that information to the government either. So a lot of phone companies, email hubs, providers, servers, email servers, libraries, they've run into that a lot where they can choose if they want to disclose or not that the government has been accessing that information. So there was a kerfuffle like 5 years ago, I think, when Google admitted that, yeah, they have been letting the government access, that information because the government said it was relevant, but they waited quite a few years before they told the public because they didn't actually need to. Okay. Any questions about the differences between kind of then and now when we're looking at privacy or privacy laws and information gathering? Okay. I think there's probably a delay between the two, but I'm gonna keep going, and if something pops up, I will read it out. Okay. So we had a lot of different segments that were talked about in the article that you read. I'm just going to go over a few of the ones that I thought were most interesting, or at least had kind of the stickiest discussion, where I was a bit more anxious about, that information getting out, because I thought the argument for it is interesting. Libraries. So, at the beginning, maybe when you read that section, having access to library records probably seems fairly innocuous. You're not doing, literally, it's provided by the city. There's nothing illegal in a library. There's no law you're breaking by reading books or checking out books at the library, right? So what would be the harm in checking out those books? But if we put it in context of more historical kind of ideological debates that we've had in our country, something like the McCarthy trials, right? Then you can start to see where having a very detailed knowledge of what an individual has been reading and what knowledge that they've been exploring can actually be pretty harmful to someone, and maybe create a profile of an individual that should have been private that the government now has access to. So if I'm reading a lot of communist kind of propaganda books in the library, or a lot of books about, how government can control the market, and I get picked up for a McCarthy trial, having access to my entire about opinions that individuals hold, political affiliations, ideologies, their understanding of the world at large by looking at what they check out at the library, or even how they're using the computers at the library. So if you have that information, you get maybe sensitive information about them. within the Patriot Act, the authorities are able to access business records and quote all tangible things in the library, which they've taken to mean computer records, book records. What books have you checked out? When are you at the library? What events have you participated in? But that's again, they get a lot of discretion in how they use all tangible things, right? You can choose to interpret that in different ways. So you can actually kind of decide what that means based on what maybe you want to get out of the investigation. Pretty similar to what we talked about last week, right? Those ideological innovators who can decide kind of, this is how I want to push our understanding of this concept. If they've got language in a law that gives them that kind of discretion to decide where they're going to push the wording, then you can get the same kind of effect where the definition gets broader and broader and covers more and more things. They do not need probable cause, and the request for information from the library must be complied with immediately, which, sure, probable cause definitely is not a standard for how normally we, behave in the legal system in the United States. And then the library cannot disclose that a search has occurred. So where Google kind of maybe had the choice to, at some point later, maybe we tell you that the government has been doing this. Libraries can't tell you if the government has asked to access an individual's information for these kinds of things. So big changes in it, I think, not as a direct ramification, but I think this one has more of an insidious kind of feeling to it, where it could be really dangerous depending on how much they're following the term all tangible things, and then if they're acting in good faith. So if they are doing it purely to understand, like what someone who has been accused of a crime was reading, and not to maybe do it the other way around and look at readings and then try and see if those people, could be called criminals. Like, that's the danger that I think a lot of the arguments when we're looking at privacy kind of create, is it makes sense in one direction, but if they ever try to apply the logic backwards, that's where it gets pretty dangerous, right? Okay, so libraries. Again, if you have any questions, post them in the chat and I will answer them for you. Okay, so education institutions. The University of Iowa, right? What rules changed under the Patriot Act for them? No longer do they require student consent for disclosure of information, so they don't have to get your permission for the school to tell the government what's going on with your grades. And this would be, student records, and then passport. Okay. So they don't need to get your consent to disclose your records. The school does not need to tell you that they have disclosed your records to the government. And then finally, for international students, which makes sense logically, right? If you want to, make sure that there isn't a foreign influence coming into the school. Yes, okay, and Hannah is pointing out kind of the initial concerns that start coming up. She's asking, any idea why the university may lose a student's records because they have lost my citizenship information 3 years in a row? So what these kinds of requirements do, and I'll talk about this, I think, in another slide for maybe just a touch, is that it requires the school to maintain a massive amount of information, right? We have more than a few international students at the school, and every single one of them needs to have all of this information, right? It's probably a fairly new system if they have one, and if they're using a third-party vendor, then who knows, what happens when maybe an update comes through. And these are not, these are fairly new rules. So this didn't happen until at least 2003 and maybe later for them, which seems like a long time, but I'm sure for an institution this size is not long enough to create a very consistent, reliable system that they're storing all of this information on. So that could definitely be why it probably glitches out, it probably loses stuff. Maybe 1 year it just auto-wiped, like a department because it felt like it. It's creating a lot of vulnerabilities for people, for their information to either get accessed by others or to just disappear into the ether, which I know that you're asking me that, like, are they being kooky about it? But I bet you they've literally just lost it. Like that's totally plausible. I'm sure they're not using the best system in the world for this, but that's kind of one of the concerns that comes up on this. If you're requiring an institution to hold all of that information and organize it and catalog it and then refresh it every year, that's a lot to ask, right? Do they have the bandwidth to manage that? Do they have the storage and security to keep all of that information under wraps? You can say they do or they don't, but it just creates a new opportunity for that information maybe be accessed by nefarious people, right? But I am sorry that they've lost your stuff that often, Hannah. That stinks. That must be a pain in the butt to like re-upload to them. Can't imagine. That's papers you just like to have, like with you constantly. Okay, so I've kind of been trying to point out common themes as we've gone through it, but let's reiterate them again, just to be sure that we've gone through all the main ones. The Patriot Act and the kind of resulting changes in our privacy laws have dismantled the wall between foreign intelligence and law enforcement intelligence gathering. So that's the way the article phrases it. What they're talking about is that the way that foreign intelligence used to work had to get integrated into our domestic structure, right? So the way that the police used to operate and the rules and the restrictions so that our privacy was not violated had to be changed to reflect the new foreign policy situation. So when those were integrated together, because they had never been integrated together before, right? Those had to be integrated so that foreign policy could adequately determine where the security threats were coming from domestically. But that means that you tear down the wall between the two and fundamentally change how both of them are behaving. So Hannah is clarifying that they're not being hinky, they're just being odd. Yeah. Yes, it's probably literally just computer errors is my guess, because I can't imagine that system is very consistent, and it's probably massive and gets confused. And I'm sure there's a lot of, like little changes that have to go on to match each student's individual like citizenship situation. And then with all the changes that have been going on recently with like how different countries are understood, I'm sure it just gets confused, and it probably just deletes things that confuse it, is my guess. But it's still, yeah, I can totally understand that it's just a massive system that has to control a lot of very kind of fine-tuned, was broadened, and the level of suspicion required to grant court orders was reduced, right? So they could gather more information about you, and they just really had to say that it was about terrorist investigation, and that was all, you did not need probable cause or justification of purpose to gather that information anymore. Weakening of judicial safeguards. Part of that is the transparency we were discussing before, where they don't have to tell students that their information was gathered. They don't have to tell the public that information was gathered. So when people don't know which information is being gathered, how can they have checks to make sure that it was done appropriately or for a good reason, right? So when you keep all of that stuff kind of secretive, it also makes it harder to make sure that it's being done fairly. That's that second point again, and then undermining the fair information principles. So the article does not discuss this very much, but I do want to clarify to you guys that the fair information principles are actually a set of international rules or principles that's kind of been agreed upon, that every business and kind of country should try and abide by this common idea of not abide as well to these principles. All right. Any questions about the more just like purely privacy-based discussion or that article at all? Kind of like that I can still connect these thematically to the stuff we talked about yesterday, or even, from like the network-centric warfare. All of these still have some pretty common themes running through them, but this is a lot about you have a concept, when it gets broadened or when it gets deepened, what's going to happen? What is the fallout to it? Okay, if you have any questions, keep posting them. I will call them out as I see them. Okay, so let's go into more like hard and fast facts then. What are the policy implications to these changes? There was essentially the creation of domestic surveillance, right? That's a lot of the scary stuff that Edward Snowden likes to talk about. But essentially, because you had to integrate the foreign policy into our kind of police investigations, what you're creating is a way to surveil the citizens of the United States, right? It's to ensure that a terrorist attack doesn't happen, but it's a new concept that really hadn't been we're discussing. There's way too much information for the government to ever reasonably be able to understand or comb through fully, right? There's so much data that they're gathering. If you're gathering every person who's ever connected to any terrorist, possible crime ever, and you collect all of the information sources that we talked about with them, that's going to take forever, right, to ever go through. There's no way that they're coherently or comprehensively going through any of that. So you're just gathering a bunch of information and not really doing anything with it, which can create its own problems. The article goes through a lot of kind of scary discussions about a national ID system, and I'm sure that brings up a lot of scary connotations to you guys. But this article was written in 2003 or 4, if I remember correctly. It's been a fair amount of time since then. So let's talk about these scary things that they mention and that they hope don't happen, and then the ways that they have happened in our country. So create this means for a national identification system. We actually have tried to create a national ID a couple times throughout the years. We don't formally have one right now, but have you guys noticed all the signs you've been seeing in airports lately about having a gold star on your driver's license? That's creating a standardized level of information that each state has acquired for you to get your state ID or your state driver's license. And that is enough for you to have that ID and not need an additional form of identification at the airport. So what they're doing instead of creating a kind of national ID system is saying, you're not required to have this certain kind of ID, but if you want to travel, if you want to use an airplane at all, you need to have a form of identification that has given the government a certain level of access to your information. So once you have those, then you can use a plane. So it's not, it's a kind of more roundabout way of creating something similar to a national ID. But at the end of the day, I think it does accomplish kind of a lot of the goals that they were trying to hit when they proposed the national ID initially. And then if we go to the domestic surveillance and massive amount of information, we can look at the debates about facial recognition software that's been happening in certain cities across the country, right? I know that, was it Dayton or Ohio as a whole tried to put in even just like traffic cameras to, catch red light runners. And Ohio law, it went appealed, and they actually decided that that was a violation of your right to privacy, that they couldn't put those cameras at stoplights. So those were all taken down, which seems, fairly normal, I think, for somewhere like Iowa or other states where you guys have lived. But Ohio said that it was a violation of your privacy. Or you have other states or other cities that have tried to install facial recognition software to try and identify criminals or people who shouldn't, be in certain parts of town or who were just caught committing crimes. And there's been a lot of debate about access to facial recognition software for reasons other than directly, trying to catch a criminal who is actively fleeing a crime scene. Is using that kind of data for things other than the standard probable cause investigation of a crime. And if you give them the power to do that, how can you make sure to limit it to its correct use, right? So there's a lot of ways you can take the basic concepts that were. So what I want you guys to get out of that, at least, isn't that I think that, the government is spying forever and Big Brother, 1984, all of that. I just want you guys to be able to critically evaluate what the actual causal outcomes of a policy can be, right? And I think the Patriot Act is one of the biggest ones we can look at, and it's this debate on privacy is something that we actually get exposed to pretty frequently in the news, so it should be pretty salient to you guys. But really understanding that you can't 100% assume that everyone who's given discretion in a policy is going to use it in the way that you intended. They have their own things that they want to achieve, right? Their own goals that they want to reach. And as you can see from like the Gold Star stuff that we've had, some of the stuff where they're going to fearmonger and people are going to push it to the limit and say, we'll never do that. This is super scary. Never give them the power. Sometimes I went on a little rant there, but hope you enjoyed it. Okay. Any questions about this stuff at all before I switch on to my next kind of out? Oh, give me a second. Okay. So this is the more technical part of my talk. So I'm talking about a lot of computer things. And if I say anything that's confusing or you guys get muddled through on any of this, let me know and I will break it down a bit more clearly. So encryption, we talked about briefly in your cybersecurity week. I'm not sure how technical Cassandra got. Looking at the slides that she had, I don't think she went very technical on it. So I wanted to kind of explain to you guys a bit more clearly how the process of encryption works and why some of the arguments to create like backdoors to encryption or, you know, to just give the government like a code or something so they can get through it, why those are a bit more difficult than you would initially think, or what the implications for allowing those to be created are. Okay, so we've got some basic concepts and terms right here. What is encryption? It is the process of encoding messages or data so that only certain people can read it, right? If we did this from a non-computer standpoint, it's making a secret code, right? You're using a decoder ring, you're doing a little cipher, you're making little new symbols or whatever. All of those are technically encryption, but usually when we talk about encryption nowadays, we're talking about it from a computer standpoint. When we have the more modern technology, encryption essentially becomes an algorithm that scrambles the message, and then the viewing party has their own algorithm that they apply to it to unscramble that message and get the actual meaning of the data, right? So we've kind of moved on from decoder rings and created really long, complex mathematical equations to scramble our data. But then at the end of the day, we're still just unscrambling and descrambling data. So encryption is scrambling the data, and then decryption is unscrambling the data, right? So just, again, we're just code breaking essentially, but with computers and about, you know, your internet history or how to get access to your phone or every website. So encryption actually isn't new. I mean, I know I talk about it in like a code breaking kind of way, but even the idea of encryption itself is fairly ancient. Initially started with just the basic scrambling of letters, but eventually we started to build machines that could do it, like mechanical machines that would scramble letters using a system. This is right here, this is a picture of the Enigma machine used by Germany in World War II, right? There's a pretty, I never actually saw this movie, but there's a lot of movies about the Enigma device, but The Imitation Game was talking about how Alan Turing from the United Kingdom was able to crack the encryption that this device used and actually figure out what system they were using to scramble the letters so he could unscramble them and understand all of the German kind of orders that were being transmitted through it, right? So being able to decrypt a code like this is entirely possible, but you can make it more or less difficult. And a lot of the debate with the cracking the Enigma machine was even not letting them know that we'd cracked it. Yeah, there's other stuff that goes on with Alan Turing. He had a terrible life, but he did help us crack the Enigma code, which is great. Okay. But that's encryption in World War II. That's a really long time ago. We're not using literal machines to encrypt our phones, right? It's something that's going on in the software. So what are we doing? We are using computer algorithms. There's a lot of different ways that computer algorithms can be used to encrypt data. And if you look online, there's a bunch of different programs that are fairly popular for doing it nowadays. But I'm just going to talk about two of the key techniques that are used, really. There's a private key version or a symmetric key, if you want, and then there's a public key version. So in a private key or a symmetric version of encryption, so there's a random string of bits or your random like bit of code that you have that is used to scramble and unscramble the data. And the person who scrambles it and the person who gets sent the data and then unscrambles it uses the exact same key. So everyone in that system is using like a private code, a little secret passcode to encrypt and decrypt the data. So you want to keep that passcode secret so that other people can't access your information. That style has its own uses. People use it for different things, but the key kind of differentiation of that style is that it is a private code between the two of you, or however many people you've shared it amongst. You don't want anyone to get access to that little bit of code that you're using to create your encryption. Yeah. On the other hand, you can have a system called the public key version, and what that does is there are to encrypt and decrypt your messages. The public key is actually published. It's made widely available for everyone to see. Everyone knows that, 1234 is Aubrey's public key. You can use that to decrypt messages from Aubrey. The thing that they keep private message have access to that private key to unscramble your messages. So it creates a more secure system because people are able to see your public key, test it, see if they can get through it. You can make it as strong as you want because people are always having access to it, but they don't have enough information to actually decrypt all of your messages unless they have that private key as well. And then I've been saying algorithm, which is the thing that is used to encrypt or decrypt messages. But if we look at computer terms, that is called a cipher. That's actually the term for what you're using to encrypt or decrypt your messages. I think, yeah, okay. I did this visually as well because explaining a public-private key thing is confusing. So this picture will pretty much tell you how it's working. Essentially, if Bob wants to send a message to Alice, all right, Bob will send his message, encrypt it using Alice's public key. So he has this gibberish that he has created then, and then he sends that to Alice, and Alice can use her private key to decrypt that message and get it from Bob, right? So there's both a public, if someone else tries to use their private key, they're not going to get the clear message back. And if anyone can still see Alice's public key and try and at least send a message to her and she can decrypt it. So it gives you a lot more variation in who you can send messages to. It's a lot more secure, I would feel like, because you don't have to actually worry about keeping your public key secure. You can leave it out there for everyone, but that private key becomes way more important because not only can you not read messages that people are sending to you, but then everything that has been sent with your key is now decryptable, right? So I talk about that a bit more here. The symmetric system with only the one public key is pretty good because it allows direct messages between two groups that have previously exchanged keys, right? So it's kind of nice because you know that the only people who can read it are people you've actually talked to and interacted with and already have that key from you, so you can feel pretty confident about them. The asymmetric system with this public-private key system, a little less direct because anyone can send you a message because they have your public key, right? But no one can actually read the contents except you. So that might be more of what you're looking for when you're looking at encryption. Different advantages, disadvantages. There's different ciphers or algorithms that are really popular on the internet right now to use these different systems. But these are the two main differences or two different ways that data can be encrypted on the internet. Do you guys have any questions about that? I know that the public-private key thing can be a little confusing. All right. Okay. Those questions if you've got them. Okay, so the government and encryption, right? I'm talking a lot about computers. We talked about privacy earlier. How do we mix these two together? How has the government behaved about encryption over the years? There's a question. Do you have any examples of these? Like examples of, Paige is asking this. There are encryption languages. I don't have them written down on the slides. But yes, you can have, well, even like an application of encryption would be WhatsApp. WhatsApp argues that they have end-to-end encryption, that the message you send gets encrypted and then it is decrypted by the sender and only by the sender. So that's why the government can't really spy on the information you send on that app as well. compared to like a regular text message, which might not be encrypted. I believe Apple has been pushing that most of their iPhones just inherently encrypt anything you're sending through them. Not sure how that's doing right now. But yeah, like WhatsApp is the easiest example of really widely used encryption software that encrypts your messages and makes it so only the intended recipients can see it. The one that's gotten in trouble most recently for not having encryption is Zoom, right? That's a lot of what's in the news lately. That's why New York can't use Zoom anymore for their online schooling. It's because Zoom said they had encryption and they don't. So they argued that the information was getting sent all scrambled and that only the recipient could unscramble it. And with the differences though between the two, I don't have them up on the slides right now. So I don't have some solid examples to give you of who uses which type. A good question. Yeah, now I'm curious. Okay, so when we're looking at encryption in the government, is there an argument that you could say that having an encryption be strong enough that the government can't break it, does that make it a national security risk? That's kind of the question that gets posed a lot. As technology has evolved and the encryption or decryption software has become more and more complex, increasingly the government can't break encryption. Essentially, it's pretty much gotten to the level where unless you have a quantum computer, you can't break most of the encryption that's going around right now. So it's pretty difficult. So how can the government respond to information that, regardless of if it's about a terror plot or about a crime or about hurting people, they cannot access it without permission from the person who created it? So that theoretically could definitely be a security risk. They've tried to address this question before. In the 1990s, they tried to make a law that required something called a Clipper chip to be put into all computers so that they would have kind of like not a flaw in the encryption system, but they just wanted to have some way for the government to gain access to the information on a computer that had been encrypted so that they could still, stop people if they were committing crimes. It was quickly hacked by someone, a third party, who showed that by putting that chip in, you created a flaw in the encryption and created a backdoor for anyone to use to get through to that computer, right? So didn't really help anything. And at the end of the day, what it did do is create a way for criminals to use it. So a lot of the debate that happens when if you're trying to even just like limit how complex encryption can be for citizens, what you're doing is putting citizens at a disadvantage by either putting a hole in the encryption or by making their encryption weaker, while not limiting criminals who will just continue to use the open source encryption that continues to evolve to this day, right? So all you're doing is actually just making it easier for crimes to be committed on American citizens, and you're not actually stopping any criminals. So why, the argument for kind of trying to create any restrictions on it doesn't make a lot of sense. Is the shooting in San Bernardino. So this shooting had 2 shooters enter a party for the developmentally disabled. They killed 14 people. There were concerns that they were connected to other terror plots, that they had friends who were going to do something, that they knew plans for something that was going to happen in the future, but both of the shooters were killed in the shooting. So they couldn't question them to find out what was going on. But what they did have was access to their iPhones. The only problem was that iOS 9 had, I think it's 9, they had just put in a new level of encryption that pretty much made it so you had 3 tries, and after that the phone was wiped. So they couldn't do endless attempts to get at it. And they also had reached such a high level of encryption that it was really difficult to kind of try and break the algorithm or try to, reverse engineer the algorithm to get into it and descramble it. So what the police and eventually what the government tried to do, understand how to descramble their own code and then give that to the government so they could use it to open up the 2 iPhones to see if there were any messages that these 2 had sent about any other future attacks. So what do you guys think Apple's response was? Do you remember what Apple's response was, or why Well, I'll just ask that, yeah. What do you guys remember about Apple's response to this, or even other tech people, companies, what their responses were to this? Yep, so Brian and Hannah are correct. Apple said no. Said we're not going to do that. And what they were arguing was, let's see if I put this up here. No, let's go back there. Okay. What Apple argued was that they technically could. Haley also says yes, that Apple said no. Hannah said didn't go to court, and I believe the court ruled in favor of Apple. Yes, so they did eventually try and take it to court, if they really wanted to, but they didn't want to because it would show where the flaws were in their own encryption. It would give potentially access to a whole bunch of other phones than just these two. There was no guarantee that the government wouldn't use this new ability to then apply it to a bunch of other cases, right? If they're given that discretion, would it be applied to other places? So they didn't want to, and there was no guarantee that that code, once they wrote it, would ever be secure, right? If you put that code into a computer, it lives on that computer. Why would every hacker in the world not want to get access to that code? That came on law that pretty much said that they didn't have to give this to the government. What happened during that court case, though, was the government pushed against it. They tried to argue, you should boycott Apple, that Apple was putting people in danger, that it had all of these issues. But for the discretion standpoint, at least, they couldn't be consistent on that because as soon as this was proposed and brought up in court, I think 4 other states immediately said, actually, once you have that, I want it too, because I have like 50 iPhones sitting in my, precinct that I can't unlock right now. I want to unlock those. So if you use it, then I want it. So they were worried that it would also create a really big precedent of everyone wanting access to this, decryption code. What the government ended up doing was actually going to a third party. So they found some probably white hat hacker, I guess would be the term for it, who said, I can do it for you. They did it. They broke into the phone and they got the information to the government. So at the end of the day, they didn't actually finish the case. I think they settled is the term. And a third party individual came in and said, I'll hack the phone for you. Don't make Apple do it. Like, it's not going to be universal. It'll be for these 2 phones and that's it. So they got someone to do it for them. They couldn't get this case to be resettled really cleanly because it opened up this huge debate about how secure encryption actually is if you write a code to get into it. At the end of the day, if you make that private key public to people, then they have both ends of it. They're going to be able to unscramble all of your messages, right? So, bit of a non-starter on the ending of the case. They didn't finish it super cleanly because the government kind of gave up on their push. They just said, whatever, we got some third party to do it. It's not our issue anymore. So that was a few years ago. Formally, the FBI has created something called the OTD, the Operational Technology Division, which is supposed to be addressing these issues of encryption and kind of data security within the FBI. So when you have encryption, when you're using only WhatsApp or something about the information they were able to get off the iPhone, or like or what are you thinking about when I say they were trying to access the person's iPhone? What's one place that they could easily get to that probably isn't as secure that would have a lot of the information off of your own iPhone? Even if they couldn't get to your physical device, what could they do to get a lot of information from your phone? This is for those iPhone users or the people that read the news, either or. Yes, I will repeat the question. So they can't access, they can't get past the passcode on their phones, but what information was probably easier to access for the police? And Colin has gotten it, right? The cloud. They just went onto the cloud and they got pretty much all of the messages that those two had been sending to each other. A lot of their search history, they got it all because the cloud wasn't encrypted the same way that the actual access to the phone was, right? So what this kind of encryption issue does is instead of having, or through your Google account. Yeah, if they can't get to your phone, they'll just go to the cloud account that you have that stores all that data on a less secure place. So really at the end of the day, the encryption can maybe stop the government from getting like those last 4 messages that didn't get backed up, but all it really does is force them to go a little bit further out to more tangential kind of observation. So just the last place that you talked that wasn't encrypted, and they just access it that way. So it's a little bit more work, but they can still get the information they need. Yes, and then the OTD addresses these kinds of issues. Yes. Okay, I think, that was all I had for you guys. So, do you guys have any questions? We've got like 5 more minutes. Do you have any questions about the encryption process or anything else we talked about today? Does the quiz today include this lecture? Says Ashley. No, the quiz only goes up to the robotics week that we did last week. So gray zones through robotics and drones. Any other questions? I know encryption can be a little fuzzy, so I try to address it like visually and through words. How to run a Kahoot without other players. I don't know off the top of my head, in all honesty. I know people have been running it, I guess. Can you just you can look at the questions though before you run it too, right? You can at least get what we're talking about. But I don't know, how have you guys been running it without other players? Oh, so Hannah's been playing it on her phone and her computer, so that's 2 people. That should work. Play it with your siblings. Yeah. I think you only need 2 people at least anyway, so. Yeah, so play the game on your computer and then, you answer the questions in on your phone. As long as you have 2 devices that can access the internet, you should be able to play it. Does that answer your question, Nate? Because it's really just a study tool. It's not, showing me that you got first place or anything. Okay, cool. Yes, sorry. I don't know, do you want it'd be final exam for the last one anyway, but I can try and just list the questions if you want. I just figured the Kahoot's a bit more fun. Yeah, gives you some music playing in the background. Times you. But I can just list the questions off on Icon too if you want. All right, any other questions about information from this week? You guys just need to make sure you get your quiz done by the end of the day. I'll post a participation substitute. Okay, I can make them a little longer. Hannah is asking for the Kahoots to be a bit longer, and I am fine with doing that. Yeah. So the plan is for the discussion boards to be pretty open-ended, just because they are substitutes for participation. So maybe watch the live stream or the video if you're watching it later, and then post your feelings on it, things that maybe confused you, just more than that was great, or I couldn't see anything. Just a substantive comment about something from this week that you have opinions on, and that would be enough to get your participation score in on the discussion board. So very similar to what you guys have been posting in the comment section here, but on discussion board form. Hannah is asking if you need to post in both places. No. If you have already commented here on the live stream, then you do not need to comment on the discussion board. You can if you want to, but you do not need to. You would already get full, so Hannah already has full participation because she's been posting questions in the chat. You don't need to post again to get the full points for this week. But I'm assuming that people will be watching this video later and they will need to post on the discussion board. So I'm just going to say the directions here. Yeah, no problem. Okay. We are about out of time, but so one last call for questions, but it doesn't seem like any of you guys have questions about the lecture. If anything comes up when you're reviewing, you're free to email me. Otherwise, I will see you guys next week. Have a wonderful weekend.